Welcome to The Explainer. You've heard of a million times, right? Opposites attract. But then you've also heard birds of a feather flock together. We are just surrounded by this kind of common sense that sounds really wise, but it often directly contradicts itself. So how are you supposed to cut through all that noise? Well, today, we're going to build the mental toolkit you need to think critically about psychology and human behavior.
I mean, we've all heard this kind of advice. Look before you leap, but then someone else says, he who hesitates is lost. This right here is the biggest problem with folk wisdom. For just about any saying you can think of, there's an opposite one that sounds just as true.
And that's the thing, right? This confusion, it's the perfect example of why we can't just rely on our intuition. We need a much better, more rigorous system to figure out what's actually true about how we all think and act.
The real problem is that our intuitive common sense is often just a jumbled mess of cliches that cancel each other out. And a system of belief that can explain anything after the fact, well, it's pretty much scientifically useless.
So let's go ahead and build that toolkit. We're going to arm you with some really powerful principles that act like a filter, helping you separate real psychological science from all the pseudoscience that is, let's be honest, everywhere.
All right, let's start with maybe the most important tool in our kit. It's a simple idea, but it is incredibly powerful, and it will instantly help you spot a theory that just isn't worth your time.
Okay, so here's the core idea. A truly scientific theory has to make a specific prediction about the world. It has to go out on a limb, and actually risk being proven wrong. If a theory can just wiggle around and twist itself to explain any possible outcome, then it hasn't really explained anything at all.
This is a fantastic historical example. Dr. Rush's theory about bloodletting, it was a perfect trap, a completely closed loop. See, if the patient got better, great, it proved him right. But if the patient died, well, he'd just say the disease was too severe for any treatment, which also proved him right. His theory wasn't making a risky prediction, it was just coming up with an excuse for every outcome.
Okay, so now we know how to spot one of those unfalsifiable theories. Let's look at two other really common ways our brains get tricked by evidence. First, by confusing correlation with causation, and second, by falling for really vivid stories.
This sounds completely bizarre, doesn't it? Are we supposed to believe that buying a toaster is a form of birth control? Of course not. This is a classic, textbook example of one of the biggest errors in human reasoning, mistaking correlation for causation.
So what's really going on here? The real explanation is something scientists call a third variable. In this case, that variable was socioeconomic status. See, people with a higher socioeconomic status, they tended to own more electrical appliances, and they also tended to use more contraception. The toaster and the birth control weren't directly connected at all. They were both just downstream effects of that third factor.
All right, now for that second trap, the vividness problem. The thing is, our brains are just not built for abstract statistics. For example, every single week in the United States, over 350 people die in car crashes. Now, to put that in perspective, that is the equivalent of a fully loaded jumbo jet falling out of the sky every single week.
And yet, we don't have a national panic about driving. Why not? Well, it's because those deaths are all spread out. They're just a number, a statistic. But a single, dramatic, fiery plane crash, that can dominate the news for days and make us terrified to fly, even though flying is statistically way, way safer. A vivid emotional story will almost always feel more real to us than cold, hard data.
So, our brains love these vivid stories, but they also love patterns. And that's usually a good thing, but it becomes a major blind spot when we have to deal with randomness and probability, because we start seeing connections in what is actually just pure noise.
Let me throw a quick puzzle at you. Imagine there's a disease that affects just 1 in every 1,000 people. Pretty rare. Now, there's a test for it that's 95% accurate. If you take that test and it comes back positive, what's the probability that you actually have the disease? Go on, take a guess. Most people, even doctors, they guess somewhere around 95%.
The actual answer is about 2%. Seriously, how is that even possible? Well, we forget the single most important piece of information, the base rate. The disease is incredibly rare. Only 1 in 1,000 people has it. Since the test has a 5% false positive rate, it's going to wrongly flag about 50 of the 999 healthy people. So in the end, you wind up with about 51 positive tests, but only one of them is the real deal.
This mental blind spot, it leads directly to what's called the person who fallacy. You've definitely heard this before.
When you tell someone that statistically smoking drastically shortens lives, someone always chimes in with, "Oh yeah, well I know a person who smoked 3 packs a day and lived to be 81. They're using a single vivid example to try and blow up a huge, well-established probabilistic trend. We have to train ourselves to trust the statistics, not the one-off exceptions.
So, if our brains are this full of bugs and glitches, how in the world does science make any progress at all? Well, the answer is that the real process looks nothing like those eureka moments we see in the movies.
Yeah, the media absolutely loves the breakthrough story, right? The lone genius in a lab who has a flash of insight that changes everything. We could call it the Einstein syndrome. But that's just not how science usually works. The reality is a much slower, much messier process called converging evidence.
See, here's the key. Every single study has flaws. But a solid scientific conclusion doesn't rest on one perfect study. It rests on dozens of imperfect studies, correlational studies, lab experiments, field studies, that all have different strengths and weaknesses. It's only when all these different methods start pointing toward the very same conclusion that our confidence really grows. It's about the overall trend, not one single result.
And there's another really important rule, the principle of connectivity. A genuinely new scientific theory can't just come along and ignore everything we already know. It has to explain the old data and the new data. This is a big reason why pseudoscientific claims often fall apart. They ask you to just throw out decades of established knowledge from neurology, biology, and physics, all based on one revolutionary new idea. Real science is cumulative. It builds on what came before it.
So what's the secret sauce? It's not that scientists are superhuman or somehow immune to bias. They have the same flawed brains as the rest of us. The real power of science comes from its social structure. It's a system where a bunch of fallible people are constantly, ruthlessly trying to prove each other wrong. That tough process of peer review and replication, that's what slowly, painstakingly gets us closer to the truth.
So we've built a pretty powerful toolkit here, right? We have the falsifiability test, the third variable problem, the vividness trap, and the principles of convergence and connectivity. The final question isn't really about psychology, it's about you. If you were to turn this toolkit on your own deeply held beliefs, which ones do you think would actually stand up to the scrutiny?